As Ukraine battles to defend its territory against Russia's invasion with heavy weaponry, an alarming number of civilians caught on the wrong side of the fighting are subject to a horrendous but effective weapon in Moscow's arsenal: sexual violence. These crimes target women first and foremost, but people of all genders and ages have become victims. A new report, Conflict-Related Sexual Violence in Ukraine, points out ways the international community and the government of Ukraine can help victims find justice. It does so drawing on the experience of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina 3 decades ago. The report says since the start of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in 2014, there have been countless reports of CRSV committed by the Russian forces against Ukrainian civilians of all ages and genders. That is conflict-related sexual violence, of course. According to a report by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine published in October of 2022, conflict-related sexual violence carried out by Russia in Ukraine is being used as a tactic and a weapon of war. The report details extensive sexual violence against men, women, children, and the elderly. Let's bring in Emily Prey. She's the director at the Gender Policy Portfolio at the New Lines Institute and one of the authors of this report. Ms. Prey, welcome to the day. Now, rape and sexual violence are often called the cheapest weapon of war. Do we have any indication as to how widespread this kind of abuse is in the war in Ukraine?
Yes, we do. So this report that I wrote with Professor Tanya Domi and Dr. Kinsey Spears, we worked with the Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine. And so far, their team that works on conflict-related sexual violence, they've documented 231 cases of CRSV as of this month, September. But if we're looking at whole of the war, we know this conflict started in 2014. Russian affiliated forces have been using sexual violence as a method of war, as a method of genocide. And so the continued use of sexual violence since 2022 shouldn't come as any surprise to anyone who's been paying attention.
So there is a sense that this is being used systematically as a means of psychological warfare.
Yes, the Office of the Prosecutor General has evidence that it's being used systematically. The New Lines Institute, where I work, also has produced several reports on incitement to genocide in Ukraine and on the ongoing genocide in Ukraine, which has evidence that it is being used in a systematic way.
Now, survivors of sexual violence are often not only traumatized, but also full of shame. What can be done to give victims of sexual violence in the context of this very, very difficult scenario, a raging war in Ukraine, adequate attention?
So the Global Survivors Fund actually did a really incredible study. They did a global reparations study for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, and we cited this extensively in our report. And they found that interim reparative measures are very important to survivors of sexual violence in conflict. And that can be anything from free legal aid to psychosocial support to childcare support to even just basic, the government acknowledging that these crimes happened and that they were real and that these survivors have special victim status. There's a lot of emphasis put on courts and international legal justice mechanisms. These are important and they have a place for sure, but they can be costly, they can be lengthy processes, an unclear deterrent effect on future atrocities. So in the meantime, these types of interim reparative measures will be incredibly important in supporting survivors of sexual violence.
And once the weapons fall silent, which we all hope is soon, how important is it for victims of sexual violence to get a say in possible peace negotiations?
That is incredibly important, and not just survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, but also women. So there's a whole agenda, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, it's a global agenda that addresses the inequitable experiences of women pre, during, and post-conflict. And research has shown that when women are involved in peace negotiations and peace talks, the peace is actually longer lasting, more durable, and more sustainable. And yet when I look at conflicts, I see again and again that women are not included when we look at Afghanistan, when we look at Sudan, when we look at Ethiopia. And so that's one of the reasons why, this report is titled Lessons from Bosnia, because we want Ukraine to look to the past, to past conflicts, to learn lessons. In Bosnia, they didn't include women in any way in the peace talks, in the Dayton peace agreement. They didn't include survivors of sexual violence in any way. And now we see conflict brewing once again in the Balkans. And so for Ukraine, it will be incredibly important when hopefully peace talks happen, hopefully soon when Ukraine wins this war, that women and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence will have a meaningful seat at the table.
One example that you pointed out in your report as a positive lesson that can be drawn from Bosnia was actually the treatment of children born out of wartime rape. How can they be protected?
So in Bosnia, an estimated 2,000 to 4,000 children were born of wartime rape, and they spent their whole lives fighting for recognition. They faced a lot of social stigmatization and shame because of their status as invisible children. And so in Brčko district in Bosnia last year in 2022, they recognized children born of wartime rape as victims of the war. And this is incredibly important because this is a population that people don't really think about. And so when we look at Ukraine, when we look at how rape is being used by Russian forces, there will be children born of wartime rape. And it's incumbent upon Ukraine to start thinking about that now and putting in place protections for those children now.
There's Emily Prey of the New Lines Institute. Thank you for your time and for your very, very important research.
Thank you for having me.